Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first episode of Fun with Procurement. I'm your host, Darren Kilford, and I'm part of the digital experience team here at 2x2. This episode is sponsored by our friends over at Freedom Media, who help organizations communicate clearly their message, both internally and externally. I'm joined today with our speakers and self-confessed procurement geeks, Robert Kizik and Nathan Swinney. Rob is a proud father of two young boys, and he loves adding value to people's lives. He is the founder and CEO of 2x2, and he set up 2x2 to help churches, schools, and charities and organizations save money and really fulfill their missions. Nathan Swinney has been working in the procurement sector for 19 years, helping businesses and schools and public and private sector organizations. Nathan's like a stick of rock that you buy at the seaside that rots your teeth. But if you were to cut Nathan open, it would say procurement all through him. So I'm really glad that you've joined us this morning. And looking forward to today's episode. And today's episode is on the topic of, isn't procurement just buying stuff? But before we dive into that, I've got a really important question for you both. Tea or coffee? Nathan?
Oh, that's a really difficult question, that, Darren. Depends on the mood, depends on the weather. So if it's a hot day, then I'll go for a tea, preferably an iced tea. And if it's a cold day, I like a nice warming mocha, something frothy and chocolatey, I think.
Brilliant. And Rob?
Yeah, interested, Nathan. For me, actually, it's probably neither. So I'm one of those weird people that doesn't drink tea or coffee, particularly if it's a really, really cold day, then I might drink tea. But my favourite warm tipple would be hot chocolate, complete probably with marshmallows and cream. And if my wife's not looking, probably a flake as well.
So. Oh, get in there.
Brilliant. Good stuff, guys. So as I said, that this episode is about, isn't procurement just buying stuff? So often when I'm asked what I do, I say I work for a procurement company, and then I have to try to explain the best I can what procurement is. I'm sure it's the same throughout your careers. You've probably been asked a lot what procurement is, and isn't procurement just buying stuff? So Rob, I'll go to you and just ask, how have you answered that question in the past?
Yeah, it's a good question, Darren, I think. And I think there's a clear distinction between purchasing and procurement. And I think a lot of people associate procurement with what they do in their everyday lives. So it's, I go and buy the shopping, or I want to buy a car, and I think, okay, I need to buy a car. Where am I going to buy a car from? And that really is not procurement. That's more purchasing, and purchasing is more of a transactional thing. And it's a placement of the order effectively around the requirement that you've got. So whether that's the food in your daily shopping or your weekly shopping, or whether that's maybe in an organisation, whether it's buying your utilities, it's the purchasing bit is the bit where you're actually doing the ordering of your utilities. Procurement is much wider than that, and procurement really looks at right from the start, what is the need and what is the thing that you actually need? How does that fit within your organisation in terms of your wider organisational strategy, and then right the way through the process from identifying that need through to identifying the suppliers that you might require to be working with to provide that need, and then right through to actually the buying, the purchasing bit, the ordering bit, and then through to the delivery of that service or that product, and then beyond that into the contract management and the review of that as well. So it's a much broader thing, I think, procurement than purchasing. Would you agree with that, Nathan?
I do. Yeah. Do you know, I was just thinking what Darren was saying, 19 years in procurement. I think I've spent 19 years trying to explain what I do for a living, and that's just to my wife. So yes, I think procurement is a lot more. I want to say the word complex. It doesn't have to be complex, but I think it's intricate compared to purchasing, and it requires a lot of organization, a lot of planning. So everything from, as I used to say, people buy everything from baked beans to bridges. And really, the process is the same. We just don't often realize we're doing it, which is exactly what you said, Rob. We've got to identify the need. We've got to research what it is that we're buying. We've got to understand the specification, as we call it. So that's the description of what we're buying. We've got to research who are the suppliers, and who could fulfill that requirement to your specification. And then it's about going through that process of seeking quotations or tenders or getting prices. And that could just be a single price through a catalogue, or it could be right through to a complex tender process with lots of evaluation. We've got to go through then a process of deciding which is the best supplier that's going to meet that need. And that could be through a combination of understanding whether it's the right price, or whether it's the right quality, or a combination of the both. It's then about awarding a contract, and whose terms is that contract on? Is it on the supplier's terms? Is it on our terms as a buyer? And then it's about seeking that delivery of those goods or those services, and then managing that contract, managing that purchase. And then at the very end, a lot of times we forget about this, but it's about disposal of that product or those goods, or the end of life, as we call it. And we call that whole process the procurement cycle. That's the whole life process of a procurement. So it is much more than just the buying bit, but we don't realize we're doing that, particularly when you go out and do your weekly grocery shop. Hopefully everyone has a list. Never go to the shop when you're hungry. That's the first rule. You should have a list, and that list should indicate what sort of things you're looking to purchase, and obviously the quality, when you need it, etc., and right through to obviously taking that home and the delivery of that, etc. So procurement is something that we do. We just don't realize we're doing it, but there's a lot more to it than just buying.
Yeah, and I think it's a really sorry, Darren. I think it's a really interesting, Nathan, in terms of that whole cycle, the whole procurement cycle. I think is something which often people kind of they miss bits out of, and I think it's important that you do look at the whole process. And I think that's where, for me, procurement is that differentiator between procurement and purchasing. Is procurement is also set in that procurement cycle within the context of your organisation. So it's saying, okay, well, actually, it's not just looking at the item in its kind of in isolation, the thing that you're buying, whereas product or service in isolation of the need of that. It's engaging that wider organisational requirement and looking at what's the strategic importance. And we talk about with procurement and purchasing in particular, we talk about the 5 rights of kind of right time, right quality, right place, right quantity. Forgotten the 5th one. Dear me. Right place, right quality, right price. Sorry, yeah. Dear me, that's terrible. But in terms of that kind of wider kind of context of procurement, you can have all of those things, but actually it might not still be the right fit for your organisation. Yeah. And I think that's where procurement is really about strategically fitting in and getting the best value out of the money that you've got as an organisation to spend, rather than just about purchasing for a one-off need.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of pressure on organisations and particularly people where procurement, forms part of their responsibility. And we work with a lot of people who actually their core competence is not procurement. It just happens to be on their desk, and they've got to be able to manage sometimes some complex, high value, high risk contracts. So take something like school catering as an example. You got a business manager or a school business manager who's dealing with an awful lot. It's a very complex job, and then all of a sudden, they're landed with the need to re-procure a major contract, which has implications across so many different risks, in terms of the children, in terms of the service. It's got the potential to close a school. So, I think procurement, as you rightly said, Rob, is strategic. And a lot of people often underestimate the amount of work it can take. But we don't want that to scare people. That's the important thing. We don't want people to feel worried or scared about that. They just need to be able to plan it. And that's the best advice we can give. And that's the difference between purchasing and procurement. Procurement is about planning. It's about seeing what's coming down the road. It's about understanding what the need is before you get to the point where you desperately have that need. And it's about getting that advice, and that's where we can help.
That's brilliant, guys. Just picking up on kind of one thing, we talked about some of the processes there. Are some of the processes different depending on whether it's private or public sector? Rob?
Yes, they are. In terms of, they're obviously public contract regulations 2015 governs how public procurement should be done within the UK. Obviously, in the process of exiting the EU and revising the rules and regulations around how we do procurement, there's a big review going on at the moment around public procurement and how it should be done differently or better for the UK going forward. So there are definitely different rules, but I think the principles should still apply. Good procurement should still be looking at how do you achieve best value for your organisation, and that effectively brings in a number of different areas. So yes, cost is one of those, but also I think we're seeing an increasing requirement in both the private sector alongside the public sector for things like social value and environmental impact to be key drivers of decision making when it comes to procurement and what goods we procure. So a lot of the principles, whilst the law might be different, that kind of governs them both, actually the principles are very similar, I think, between the two. And we see quite often when we work in the charity sector, we see organisations that are sometimes part of their funding is public funding, so they have to deal with that aspect of it and have to go through public procurement processes when they're procuring. And then other aspects of what they're buying is funded in a different way, maybe through donations, etc., and private donations, and therefore they don't have to do public procurement for that. And quite often that can be a challenge when you're in the charity sector. You're trying to work out, well, do public regulations apply or do they not? And that's certainly an area we found can be confusing within procurement that we've provided support in.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Rob. But it's getting the balance right. It's one of the things to consider are the risks. Are slightly different between public and private. So you mentioned public sector is heavily legislated, and rightly so, because it's effectively spending taxpayers' money. I think in terms of public sector, there's greater risk of legal non-compliance, and there's a challenge risk. So in terms of not procuring in accordance with the public contract regulations can result in a legal challenge to a procurement. Now, that only really applies to high value procurements above certain thresholds, but certainly the risk is very real, and we're seeing an increase in organisations receiving procurement challenges and not knowing how to handle those. In the private sector, the risk is more commercial. So, it doesn't have that legal requirement as such, but there are greater risks around loss of opportunity, loss for potential savings, loss of commercial, benefits from a poor procurement. So they both equally apply, but I think there's more of a risk on the public sector when it comes to that legal challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Nathan. And I think I do think in terms of that differentiator between the two, it's definitely in the private sector. The public sector, I guess to a certain extent, the need of the process drives you towards the procurement process. So you have your financial compliance practices within a public sector organisation, which will determine you have to go through a public procurement process for certain products of certain values, as you said. It's definitely that missed opportunity, I think, in the private sector. I think that's where we find when we engage with private sector organisations, it's very often they tend to be much larger before they start to think about professional procurement, because there isn't that driver, that legal driver that's forcing them to do that. And quite often that means there's sizable opportunities in the SME market in particular to be able to really add value. By putting professional procurement support into those organisations.
That's great. Just as you guys were speaking, I was trying to think how this might apply to a small business or a kind of medium-sized charity. Now, you said one of the important things that's a differentiator between just purchasing and procurement is planning. What steps can a small business or a kind of small to medium size charity organization take in planning? Could you describe a little bit of what that process might look like? And Nathan, would you mind fielding that one first?
Oh, it's great to be chosen first, Darren. That's lovely. So, in terms of the planning stage, we recognise small businesses, small, medium charities. It's impossible to have a dedicated procurement resource. We understand that, and obviously, it's going to take some time to be able to do it, but it's well worth the time. So in terms of that process, I think really it's about gathering as much information as possible. It's about data. So where are you spending? Who are your contracts with? Simple things like just having we call it a contracts register, but a list of all your contracts. When do those contracts start? When do they end? What's their value? Who are the suppliers? What are the terms? What's the termination periods? Is there any notice that you need to be able to give? And, we do this at home. If your car insurance is up for renewal, you want to have at least a few weeks to seek alternative quotes. At least I hope you do. So, in a small business, one of the simple things you can do to start planning better procurement is gathering that information. It's about visibility of spend. It's then about looking at obviously what are the opportunities for improvement and where are the risks. So if you've got a large spend as an organization and it's not under contract, that means you've not got a supplier that's on a fixed term contract or some sort of formal contract where you've got protections, where you've got specifications laid down, where you've got things like monitoring of that supplier, key performance indicators, that sort of thing, then that can be a risk. And I think it's about identifying where are the gaps in the spend where you need to formalize that spend. But I would say you only need to do that in the first instance for your top 20 spends as an organization. We can't there's no need to do it for everything. It's about understanding who are your top spends, where are your top spends, and which suppliers are they with, and are they under contract? And that's a great place to start, is just mapping that out. And then from that, you've got enough information and data to start planning a forward procurement plan, which means this contract's coming up for renewal next year. How long do we need to spend to re-procure it? Some contracts might take longer to procure than others. Some of them might be a quick quote and therefore it can be turned over in a couple of weeks. Some of them might require something more formal like a tender process, and therefore it might need a bit of a longer lead time in terms of procuring that. And that's especially true if it's a public sector organisation where you've got minimum timescales that apply to seek tenders. So I think forward planning is really important.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Nathan. And I think for me, small businesses and small charities, the biggest enemy is of that process is time and a lack of time.
Yeah.
Most small businesses, small organizations, small charities that we talk to, they are busy trying to deliver the thing that's kind of ignited their passion for doing what they're doing. So if you're a small charity that's working with homeless, vulnerable housed people, you're going to be passionate about doing that, and that's where you're going to want to spend your time. If you're a business that's looking to launch a new product, that's what you're passionate about, that's where you're going to be spending your time. And I think really I think your point there around the kind of 20%, the 80-20 rule is the classic one, isn't it, where you can extract kind of 80% of the value from looking at the 20% of your top spend kind of items. And I think time is a big challenge for small organizations. And it's about that prioritization piece. How many organizations, and we see it in our domestic life, I think there's a statistic, something like 15 or 20% of people have ever switched their energy online. Mm. And you think, well, that's nuts, because if you look at all of the marketing and all the advertising that says, switch and you can save 250 quid or 300 quid or whatever the amounts are through the various comparison sites, actually the fact that hardly any people, only 1 in 5 maybe, have actually done that, tells you it's not because people don't want time. Because if somebody said, well, for half an hour I can give you £300, most people would do it. But it is that it's a little bit of time, it's a little bit of this is a bit confusing. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I'm not quite sure, how easy it's going to be, what information I need. And I think if you just take that first step, for smaller businesses, focus on those big spends, say, right, okay, what can I do with those? Are there some real quick wins? Like, actually I've got contracts which have run out of contract. And actually, if I'd renewed those or found somewhere else, I could save some money there. So it is looking at what quick wins are there that are available. But small businesses are notoriously difficult, and small charities because of that time. So it's how do you overcome that barrier? Contracts register is a great idea, really simple, really easy way of keeping on top of that, and trying to identify where you can get that best value in the quickest and shortest time possible.
Yeah, we've yet to work with an organisation, even a small organisation, where we haven't identified savings, and that's as a result of contracts that have just rolled over and rolled over and rolled over, or spends that have never been sort of competed in terms of gone out for multiple quotes. It's simple things, but as Rob said, it's really important. Just start somewhere. It's like it's a bit like my diet. Sometimes I just have to start. I can talk about it, I can think about it. That's not going to help me lose weight. I just need to start, and that's the same rule will apply here. The other really important thing is someone needs to take responsibility. And I think having someone and they don't have to be a procurement professional. We're not expecting that in a small organization or a small charity, but having someone assigned to that, having someone take ownership of that is really important, and that often can be someone in finance, or it can be someone, an office manager or an administration person. Just someone who takes responsibility for that is really key, because procurement's a classic one where everybody thinks everybody else is doing it, and there's no one ever that seems to take responsibility. And what then happens is you have a lot of duplication. Well, I've got this stationery supplier. Oh, I've got a stationery supplier. And what happens is, you've got two departments that have two contracts for one organization. Whereas if you were simply to centralize that and have one person looking at it, you could economize, you can aggregate that spend and get much better terms, much better pricing as a result of that. So start somewhere. And the classic one is things like stationery, utilities, very easy, lots of competition, there's lots of routes to market, as we say, so easily can get quotes, and it's a case of then just consolidating that and working from there.
Yeah, I think on that, I think one of the key things whenever I talk to people about procurement and purchasing is why do you want to do it better? So, and it comes back to this kind of procurement being a strategic piece, and thinking about, okay, well, as an organization, as a business, as a charity, why should doing good procurement matter? And ultimately, good procurement is an enabler of your mission. And we talk to when we talk to small businesses and SMEs, and we say, well, you could manage your costs in terms of how you improve your profitability. You can increase your costs potentially. You can increase your sales by 50-60%. That's one way. That's going to take money. It's going to take time. There's risk associated with it. Or you could potentially have the same impact by just reducing your costs by between 5 and 10%. And people go, oh, really? And you go, yeah, actually, it is. If you're taking money out of your bottom line, effectively out of your costs, good procurement will enable you to grow quicker. And the same on the charity side. Yeah. If you're talking to a charity about their mission, it's, if you want funds, if you're trying to raise funds, that can be really difficult, really challenging for a charity. But actually, if you manage your procurement well, you can reduce significantly the amount of funds you need to raise. And when you're trying to find people who are, particularly in a smaller organization, you've got people who are multitasking, you've got heads are in multiple different roles. I think it's important to say, actually to link what you're doing from a procurement perspective to the mission and the output of your organization, whether that's a business or a charity or a school, the school business managers. I think if people can see that kind of thread, I talk about the kind of golden thread that runs between kind of the person who's buying, or the need to buy, and the delivery of your mission and your strategic objectives as an organization,
Yeah.
it enables it excites people, it energizes people, and it gets them more interested in focusing on those things and saying, actually, there is real value in us procuring well. And I think that can almost be a little bit of a mind shift within an organization, if you can link that procurement into the strategy as well.
Yeah, there's some great examples. We've seen schools that have tried to raise funds through donations from parents, from sponsorship of events and things like that, just because they want to invest in some new equipment for their school. When actually, if they were to revisit their stationery or their photocopier contract, is the classic one, you could raise similar, if not more, money by renegotiating that than having to organise, and actually in some cases spend money trying to raise money. It's one of those scenarios. So I think start somewhere. Start somewhere is the best advice.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Nathan, just following up on that then, you mentioned earlier a few categories. When you look at a business or an organization, are there certain kind of categories that you kind of would start with, because either they're in a very competitive market, therefore you might get a better deal, or there's always room for more negotiation on certain contracts? Sure. Just give our listeners a little bit of a hint on several contracts or areas of spend that they should start to look at.
Sure, yeah, and there's some classic categories which basically apply to almost any sector, public, private. Yes, I've mentioned things like office supplies. I've mentioned things like MFDs, multifunctional devices, some of which are amazing, aren't they? They do everything almost like make a cup of tea as well. We've got utilities, gas, electric, water, in some cases oil. If it's a rural school, for example. Things like furniture can be a hidden cost as well. You've got business services, things like HR, payroll. The list goes on. I think that one of the exciting things about procurement is that there's always room for improvement. There's always potential for improvements in quality and improvements in price. But those categories often are something that we can compete really well. There's lots of suppliers out there, lots of potential opportunities to seek alternative quotes, alternative terms. And in the current climate, in the current economy, there's businesses are desperate to win business, and I think suppliers particularly are keen to win business. So, now is a great time actually to start thinking about some of those spends. And they're great places to start, because a lot of those are reasonably low risk as well. So, you don't want to start with something that's going to be, a major high risk. It's got the potential to shut down your business. If it's a core component and you're a small manufacturing business, you need to tread carefully with that sort of procurement. But something like energy and utilities is very easily transferred and very easily dealt with in terms of re-procuring that, and as Rob say, can have a great impact on the bottom line in terms of saving cost.
That's brilliant, Nathan. Rob, I have a question for you that you touched on earlier as well. Sometimes it can sound like, you're just trying to get the best deal from the supplier that's possible. But from your experience, it's not just all about the saving. Is there things that you can negotiate into contracts with suppliers, striking up that partnership that can result in added social value and even furthering the enabling of organizations' missions?
Yeah, absolutely, there is, Darren. I think procurement, as you go on a procurement journey as an organization and kind of and become better at it, it's almost like procurement become the kind of what you can get out of it is like an onion. So on the kind of outer layer of an onion, you look at cost. So kind of everyone's first thought when they think about, well, let's procure better, generally is how do we get something cheaper? But procurement is about best value, and about what best value looks like is different for every organization. So I think there are definitely things beyond cost. We talk about, certainly from an environmental perspective, you can build in kind of environmental credentials and requirements. So Nathan's talked about utilities. Clearly, there's a massive shift globally towards net zero objectives, and a number of the clients that we work with have shifted. Even they've had objectives of kind of net zero 2050, but they've now shifted that and brought that forward to net zero 2030 as that's taken more priority. So, looking at utilities, you could look at are we moving to renewables? And then there's different levels of renewables you can look at as well. So, and then you can go, well, actually, do we want to buy utilities from somewhere else, or actually do we want to produce it ourselves? And then, there's a whole journey there that you can take people on around not just buying energy, but actually being a provider of energy through solar panels or ground source heat pumps and various different mechanisms for that. So I think environmental is definitely an aspect. Social value, I think, is an area where people are really kind of certainly in the last kind of 15 years or so have started to wake up to. I'm trying to remember, Nathan will correct me, I think it's 2012, social value started to really come into public sector procurement. And we've seen in Wales, the Future Generations Act, the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which is all about how do you build in social value to protect future generations through better procurement. So you can look at, and that could be from jobs and employment. So does this particular procurement that we're requiring create new jobs? And if those are new jobs, what are those new jobs? What levels of skills are they? Is it creating apprenticeships, for example? And Nathan talks about the kind of different kind of proportionality and the kind of appropriateness of what you're building in to your procurement requirements to the value of the actual spend itself. So you wouldn't, for example, want to build in the requirement for 3 new apprentices if you were buying spending £10,000 on photocopiers. It needs to be proportional. It needs to be appropriate and it needs to be relevant to what you're actually buying. But I think social value is definitely there's an environmental layer to that onion. There's a social value layer to that onion, and then I think there is kind of, as we talk to a lot of organisations at the moment, they are saying this kind of mix between national and local. And part of that is wrapped up within social value, but part of it and that kind of supporting that local environment, that local community in which you're working or living and existing. So I think there is definitely a local and national that gets tied in as well, and as part of procurement, you need to think about how much of your money do you want to be spending in your local community. Certainly, organisations in the public sector have to take that into consideration, and I think we're seeing more and more charity and private sector organisations considering that as well.
Yeah, I love that analogy, that onion. That's just so true. Darren, this is why I work in procurement. It's not just about saving money. That's one of the great sort of mysteries about procurement. People think it's just about saving money, isn't it? Well, no, it isn't. There's so much more to that. It's about improving the quality. It's getting better commercial terms. It's about better relationships with suppliers, and ultimately that's what it is. It's about relationships, and I get great job satisfaction from seeing improvements. And let me give you a really good example. So school catering, yes, cost is really important, and believe me, we know that schools are really struggling with cost. So that's a really important factor when procuring. Quality of food, absolutely essential. Service delivery, trained staff, decent equipment, selections on menus. All these things are really important. I've worked with schools before where they've also built in things like school class visits to food producers. So they've taken some kids to visit a farm to see where some of the vegetables are grown. So there's so many layers to what you can achieve through procurement, and that's a great example because I've got kids at school. I want to know that they're getting a really good meal, that they've been served well, that it's healthy, nutritious. It's not just about cost; it's about all manner of different things. And a good procurement process will take account of all that and see it. And this is why we go back to the first point: why you need to plan. Because if you leave that to a week before your contract runs out, what are you going to do? You're going to rush it. You're just going to say, we'll just have what we've already got, or we'll try and actually we just want to try and reduce the cost, and you'll result in something that could have been so much better and could have delivered so much more. So I think procurement has so many layers to it, and so many opportunities to improve, and that's what makes it fun, which is what this is about.
Absolutely,
It is.
absolutely.
Just on that, I think one of the things that we've found is that there are the kind of tangible benefits of good procurement, and there are kind of the slightly less tangible ones, which are saving time. I think is a big one, and I think quite often good procurement can save organisations an awful lot of time, both unpicking the mess of bad procurement, but also actually a good procurement process is a more efficient process, and so you actually save time in the procurement itself. The other aspect of that is buying with confidence, and we talk about enabling organisations to be able to buy with confidence when we work with them. That is not to be underestimated, particularly when you're dealing with smaller organisations who don't maybe have a professional procurement person in post. It's amazing how much the weight and responsibility of having that money to spend sits on people, particularly in charities where there may be volunteers or part-time staff, and they've got this budget and they're thinking, well, how do I get best value? How do I make sure that I'm doing this in the right way? So I think there are that soft benefits as well to good procurement around enabling people to be able to buy with confidence and save them time.
Okay, so for our final question, what are the long-term benefits of improving the procurement process as an organisation? And so what I want to do is split this up a little bit to yourselves, Rob and Nathan. So Nathan, I would like you to think about that for a public entity, and Rob, if you could think about that question for a private entity, and really kind of let's think in terms of 3 to 5 years. What would be the long-term benefits that you would expect an organisation to see by doing really good, mature procurement process? So let's start with Nathan.
Sure. Yeah. So public sector, we've already touched on the legal requirements, public contract regulations 2015. I think one of the key long-term benefits there is showing compliance with that, and being accountable for that, because obviously public procurement is very much about transparency. We've got freedom of information that can be requested at any time on spends. So I think that reassurance, that sort of assurance around that it is compliant is one of the long-term benefits, and it removes that sort of that heavy scrutiny, and the potential for heavy auditing around procurement. I think reduced risk is another huge opportunity there, particularly in the public sector, particularly where you've got so many people that it impacts. So if we take a school as an example, it's not just the school itself, the staff, it's the pupils, it's the families of pupils that are affected. So I think in terms of the risk profile of procurement, and again, take school catering as a classic example, having that surety over a strategic procurement plan, ensuring that that's been managed well, reduces the risk of issues down the line, and potential messy contracts that need to be unpicked, and costly contracts. Better relationships, better supplier relationships is another great example, particularly within public sector. So again, we want to be able to work with suppliers well, and having confidence in our procurement, and making sure that procurement's run transparently, it's run efficiently, makes for a better supplier experience as well when they're bidding and tendering for things. And it goes without saying, obviously, better cost control, better quality of goods and services. So I do think that there's a lot of crossover, but I think the biggest one for the public sector is that assurance over compliance with legislation, and then ultimately public sector by its nature is there for the its strategic objectives is there for the wider good of society, as schools, hospitals, local authorities. It's all about serving the community. And again, the long-term benefits of good procurement is that it will contribute to that mission, as Rob touched on earlier. It's about ensuring that procurement delivers, that having good contracts, good suppliers, well thought out specifications, it's delivering quality, it's delivering value for money. That will contribute to the objectives of that public sector organisation, which in turn provides value for money and good quality for the community that it's serving. So many, Darren. We could do hours on this, literally.
I'm sure, and I know you could talk for hours on this. I've been in many meetings where you have. So thanks, Rob. Over to you. How that long-term improvement of the procurement process in the kind of private sector?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of crossover between the public and the private sector in terms of the benefits over kind of 3 to 5 years. As Nathan said, cost is definitely there. I think control of risk is important, but I think there is one of the key differentiators I think between the private sector and the public sector is you tend to get into a cycle in the public sector of retendering every 3 years, 4 years for a particular product or service, and if actually that's strategically important to you. In the private sector, being able to build relationships, longer term relationships with organizations that are aligned to your thinking, aligned to your kind of objectives strategic objectives as a business. I think that's something which it still hasn't quite been got right in the public sector. So that's an absolute advantage of doing it in the private sector. I think there are, from a kind of cost perspective, I think the flexibility within the private sector to be able to kind of change your values, and as you grow as an organization, be able to think about where your procurement thresholds are and how much you apply and how much work you put into your procurement as you grow is important, because I think there are some within the public sector, because there's clear thresholds of what you need to do at certain levels, that can be quite stifling for smaller organizations. So you have to put a lot of time and effort and resource into procuring when actually you might not be that big an organization. That flexibility that you can build in over 3 to 5 years as you grow, I think is an important one. And I think the other area for me in the private sector, which again is probably a stronger kind of preference than you get in the public sector, is the ability to collaborate. It does feel like in the private sector, whilst there are competitive barriers, there are more opportunities potentially to collaborate around procurement, and you see that with a number of kind of the kind of specific industries where they will get together and work on particular products. We've done some work in the automotive sector, looking at energy and energy procurement, and how organisations that are effectively working, they might be competitors on a day-to-day basis, but actually by coming together, they can create value for each other. And so I think there are more opportunities, and it's probably less barriers to being able to collaborate. And certainly as you're thinking 3 years, 5 years down the line, as you're looking to add value with your procurement and really become more strategic in your procurement thinking as an organisation, collaboration and how you can work with other organisations to start to extract greater value is definitely something I think is a strength in the private sector.
Brilliant. Rob, Nathan, I want to thank you for joining me on this episode today. It's been great having you. Some really interesting insights about the difference between just purchasing and procurement. And I feel like I've learned a lot about how important it is for organizations to be thinking about procurement and strategically planning for maturity in their procurement processes. So again, I just want to thank you for sharing those insights. And I think you're going to be joining us on our next episode as well. So I'll be looking forward to that.
Yeah, I can't wait, Darren. That sounds great. Yeah.
Yep, it's going to be fun again. Fun with procurement. So, and I want to thank you, you guys, for watching and listening. We've prepared some great resources for you. There'll be links in the show notes, and you can also go to 2by2.com/podcast. One of the resources that we'll be sharing with you, as both Rob and Nathan mentioned, a great small step to starting on the procurement journey is a contract register. Now, we have a great online tool that is free to use. You can sign up and get access to that tool. But we're also provide a simple Excel spreadsheet to get you started as well. So you'll find those links in the show notes. We're also put links where you can connect with Rob and Nathan on social media. So again, thanks for joining us. We hope you found it helpful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. I'm Darren Kilford, and thanks for listening. See you then.